I arrived 3 hours early for Thanksgiving dinner, carrying gifts for my grandchildren. I was about to knock on my daughter's door when I heard her say, "Mom can never find out about the will." Then my son-in-law whispered, "She won't be around much longer anyway." I was standing right outside the door, and they were talking about me. For a few seconds, I honestly thought I had misunderstood them. I stood on the front porch with 2 wrapped presents tucked under my arm, and a pumpkin pie balanced in my other hand. Cold November air had turned my fingers numb, but I barely noticed. I was listening so hard that my heart seemed to stop between every word. My daughter's voice came through the closed front door again. "David, please, not today." "Then when?" my son-in-law answered. "After she finds out?" There was a pause. I leaned closer without meaning to. "I told you," Emily whispered. "Mom can never find out about the will." The pie suddenly felt heavy in my hand. Then David said something that made the back of my neck go cold. "She won't be around much longer anyway." I stared at the front door. My first thought wasn't about money, it was about my daughter, Emily. My little girl, who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Emily, who had called me every Thanksgiving morning for years before she got married. Emily, who had spent the previous evening texting me about whether the turkey needed another hour in the oven. And now she was standing 10 feet away, talking about my will as if my death were a scheduling problem. I looked down at the presents in my arms. One was for my grandson Tyler, who was 9 and obsessed with baseball. The other was for my granddaughter Sophie, who was 6, and had asked me for a craft kit because she wanted to make Christmas decorations before Christmas was even here. I had spent the morning wrapping them. I had driven nearly 2 hours through traffic, because I wanted to arrive early and help Emily before the rest of the family showed up. I had no idea that I was walking into a conversation about how long I had left to live. The worst part was that I wasn't sick, at least not in any way they knew about. I was 67 years old, took a daily blood pressure pill, walked 3 miles most mornings, and had gotten a clean physical 6 weeks earlier. So why had David said I wouldn't be around much longer? And what exactly was in my will that they were so afraid I'd discover? I should have knocked. I should have walked inside and demanded an explanation. Instead, I did something I still feel guilty about. I stayed quiet. I stood outside my daughter's house and listened. "Mom trusts us," Emily said. "That's the problem," David replied. "She trusts you." "I know. And if she finds out what you signed..." "Stop." Emily's voice cracked on that last word. There was silence. Then David lowered his voice so much that I couldn't make out the next sentence. I moved closer. Nothing. I heard the scrape of a chair. Then Emily said, "Not here, please." That was when I stepped back. I didn't know what you signed meant. I didn't know what my will had to do with anything. But I knew one thing. Whatever was happening inside that house, my daughter was afraid of it. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure whether she was afraid for me, or afraid of me finding out the truth. I took a breath, wiped my face with the back of my hand, and looked at the door. Then I rang the bell. I heard hurried footsteps. A few seconds later, the door opened. Emily stood there, wearing a cream sweater, jeans, and an expression that disappeared so quickly, I almost wondered if I'd imagined it. "Mom!" She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that arrives a second too late. "Oh my gosh, you're early." I held up the pie. "I know, I thought I'd come help." She stepped forward and hugged me. Her arms felt tense around me. "You're always early." I smiled. "Only on Thanksgiving." She laughed, but it sounded forced. Behind her, David appeared in the hallway. "Linda," he said. That was my name. Normally he called me Mom. He had called me Mom for 11 years. Today, for some reason, I was Linda. "Hey, David." He smiled. "Happy Thanksgiving! Happy Thanksgiving!" His eyes dropped to the pie, then to the presents, then back to my face. For one strange second, neither of us spoke. I wondered if he knew I had heard him. Then he stepped aside. "Come on in." The house smelled like turkey, onions, rosemary, and cinnamon. It was warm, familiar, almost painfully normal. Tyler came running down the stairs. "Grandma!" I barely had time to put the pie down before he threw his arms around me. Sophie followed behind him wearing a glittery headband. "Grandma, did you bring my present?" I laughed. "Maybe. That's not an answer." "It is if you're 6. She rolled her eyes dramatically. For a moment, I forgot everything. I hugged them both. I kissed their foreheads. I listened to Tyler tell me about a baseball card he had traded at school. I watched Sophie spin around the living room showing me her Thanksgiving dress, and I thought about the sentence I'd heard through the door. She won't be around much longer anyway. I looked at my grandchildren and felt something inside me tighten. If something happened to me, these were the children who would grow up believing everything their parents told them about me. That thought scared me more than the will itself. I had lost my husband, Robert, 7 years earlier. After 41 years of marriage, losing him had changed the shape of my life. The house became quieter. Holidays became harder. Emily knew that. She had been wonderful at first. She called every night. She brought groceries. She sat with me on the couch after the funeral and cried into my shoulder. For the first few years, I thought losing her father had made us closer. Then she married David, and slowly, things changed. Not dramatically. That would have been easier to notice. It was little things. Emily stopped asking what I wanted and started telling me what was best for me. You shouldn't be driving that far anymore. You really should think about downsizing. Mom, you don't need to worry about the investment accounts. David understands that stuff. David became involved in everything. My insurance, my retirement accounts, the maintenance on my house, even the way I handled my husband's old business records. At first, I appreciated the help. Then I began noticing that they weren't helping me. They were organizing me. There was a difference. Still, I never imagined they were discussing my death. That afternoon, I decided to keep my mouth shut. I wanted to see what they would do when they thought I knew nothing. The first thing I noticed was that Emily wouldn't leave me alone. Normally on Thanksgiving, she'd be running between the kitchen and dining room. That day, she kept checking on me. Mom, do you need anything? No. Are you sure? I'm fine. You look tired. I looked at her. I drove 2 hours. I'm allowed to look tired. She laughed nervously. Right. David came into the kitchen. He was holding his phone. Linda, did you talk to your attorney recently? The question came so casually that I almost missed how strange it was. I turned around. My attorney? Yeah, just wondering. Why? He shrugged. No reason. Emily looked at him. David. What? Don't. He looked at me. I was just asking. I dried my hands on a towel. Which attorney? He hesitated. Whoever handles your estate stuff. My estate stuff? Your will, trust, whatever. I smiled politely. I haven't changed anything recently. His expression shifted, only for a second, but I saw it. Relief or disappointment. I wasn't sure which. Good, he said. Then he walked away. I watched him disappear into the dining room. Emily stayed behind. Mom, she said softly. What? David didn't mean anything by that. I didn't say he did. She looked down. Okay. I turned back to the counter. Is there something you're trying to tell me? She froze. What? I looked at her. Nothing. Mom. She stopped. For a moment I thought she was finally going to tell me. Instead she picked up a bowl. We should get the potatoes on the table. And just like that, the moment disappeared. During dinner, I sat between Tyler and Sophie. David sat at the other end of the table. Emily kept serving food even after everyone had enough. Turkey, mashed potatoes, green beans, stuffing, cranberry sauce. The usual Thanksgiving spread. We laughed. Or at least everyone else did. I tried. I really did. But every time David reached for something, I found myself watching his hands. Every time Emily looked at me, I wondered what she was thinking. Then Sophie asked a question. Grandma, are you going to live in your house forever? The table went quiet. I smiled. Why do you ask? Mom says your house is really big. Emily nearly dropped her fork. Sophie. What? Eat your turkey. But, eat. Sophie frowned. Tyler looked at me. Grandma's house is awesome. I smiled. Thank you. My house had belonged to Robert and me for 32 years. It was worth more now than we ever imagined it would be. Robert had bought it when we were newly married. Over the years the neighborhood had changed. What had once been an ordinary suburban house was now surrounded by renovated homes selling for ridiculous amounts. I had never thought of it as an asset. It was simply home. But apparently other people thought about it differently. After dinner, everyone moved into the living room. The television was on. The kids were playing a board game. Emily brought out old family photographs. That was another Thanksgiving tradition. We would sit together and look through pictures. There was one photograph of Robert holding a 6-year-old Emily on his shoulders, another of me pregnant with Emily, another of the 4 of us at Disney World. I watched my daughter's face as she looked through them. She smiled at some, skipped others. Then she came across a photograph of Robert standing beside a man I hadn't seen in years. Emily suddenly stopped. I noticed. Who is that? She closed the album. Nobody, I frowned. That's not nobody, she smiled. Just someone Dad knew. Who? Mom, it's Thanksgiving. I laughed softly. That doesn't answer the question. She put the album aside. But I had already seen something written on the back of the photograph. A name. Michael Harris. I remembered Michael. He had worked with Robert during the final year before my husband retired. Nothing about him seemed important. At least, not then. Later that evening, while the children were upstairs watching a movie, I went into the kitchen for a glass of water. I heard voices in the hallway. Emily and David. I stopped. I told you not to bring it out, Emily whispered. I didn't. Then where is it? I don't know. What if Mom saw it? I stood completely still. David lowered his voice. She didn't. You don't know that. Emily. What? Your mother doesn't know. I held my breath. Then Emily said something that made my stomach drop. The document isn't the problem. What is? The signature. Silence. I slowly set my glass down. The signature? Whose signature? I heard David say, we have until Monday. That's not enough time. It has to be. David, if Mom asks about Robert's records. I couldn't hear the rest. A cabinet door opened. Then footsteps moved toward me. I slipped into the dining room just as Emily entered the kitchen. She saw me. Her face went white. Mom? I smiled. I was looking for water. She stared at me. You scared me. I didn't mean to. She looked toward the hallway, then back at me. Are you okay? I nodded. Fine. But I wasn't. Because now I knew something. The will wasn't simply about inheritance. There was a document. There was a signature. And there was something connected to Robert's records. I went upstairs a little later to use the bathroom. On my way back down, I passed the small office where David kept his computer. The door was almost closed. I would normally have walked past. Instead, I stopped. There was a file folder on the floor just inside the doorway. I recognized the handwriting on the tab. Robert's name. I looked down the hallway. Nobody was there. I bent over and picked it up. Inside were copies of old business documents, tax records, property records, bank statements, and one photocopy of a document I had never seen before. At the bottom was a signature, Robert's name. But something about it bothered me. I had seen my husband's signature thousands of times. This didn't look right. Not quite. The letters were too careful, too slow. I stared at it. Then I heard footsteps. I put the folder back exactly where I'd found it and stepped away. David appeared at the end of the hallway. He looked at me, then at the office. What are you doing? Looking for the bathroom. He smiled. It's downstairs. I know. Neither of us moved. Finally he said, you should get some rest. I smiled. Maybe I will. That night I slept in the guest room. Or tried to. At around midnight I heard voices downstairs. I quietly opened the door. The hallway was dark. I walked toward the stairs. Emily was crying. I could hear her clearly. I can't do this anymore, David answered. You don't have a choice. I do. No, you don't. She's my mother, and she's going to find out. There was a long silence. Then Emily whispered, she was never supposed to see that document. My hand tightened around the banister. David said something I couldn't hear. Emily began crying harder. Then I heard a sentence that changed everything I thought I knew about my daughter. I never wanted her to get hurt. I stood in the darkness. Get hurt? What did that mean? What exactly had they done? And why was my daughter crying as if she were trapped inside something she couldn't escape? I went back to bed before they could see me. The next morning I woke before everyone else. Thanksgiving leftovers were packed away. The house was quiet. I went downstairs and found my purse on the chair where I'd left it. Something was sticking out of the side pocket. An envelope. I knew immediately that it wasn't mine. My name was written across the front. Linda Morgan. I stared at it. There was no return address. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single photocopy. It was a legal document dated 8 years earlier. I read the first few lines. Then I reached the signature. My husband's name. My heart began pounding. But beneath his signature was another name. Michael Harris. And next to it was a handwritten note in Robert's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. The note said, if Linda ever asks about the property transfer, tell her the original agreement was destroyed. She must never know why the transfer was made. I sat down. The room seemed to tilt. Property transfer? Original agreement? Why had Robert written that? And why was Michael Harris involved? I turned the page over. There was another handwritten line. This one was only 6 words long. I read it twice. Then a third time. Emily knows where the original is. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. Emily stood at the bottom of the stairs. She looked at the document in my hand. Her face collapsed. Mom. I held up the page. What is this? She didn't answer. Emily, what is this? She started crying. I stood slowly. Why did your father write that you know where the original is? She covered her mouth. Then David appeared behind her. He looked at the document, and for the first time since I arrived he didn't look confident. He looked afraid. Emily whispered, Mom, please. Please what? She shook her head. I was trying to protect you. From what? She looked at David, then back at me. And before she could answer, David said quietly, Linda, you need to understand something. I stared at him. What? He swallowed. The will you're worried about. He paused. Isn't the will that you think it is. I felt my stomach drop. Then he looked at Emily. And she whispered the words that made me realize Thanksgiving had never been the real reason they wanted me in that house. Mom, Dad left something else behind. I looked at the document in my hand. What? Emily's eyes filled with tears. The original will. And then she said one more thing. Something that made me realize the document in my hand wasn't proof of what they had done. It was proof that my husband had been hiding something from me long before he died. For several seconds nobody moved. I stood at the kitchen counter holding that old document, while the sounds of Thanksgiving continued around us. The oven hummed. Someone's phone buzzed on the dining table. One of my grandchildren laughed in the living room, completely unaware that the adults in the kitchen were standing on the edge of something that had been buried for years. I looked at Emily. What did your father hide from me? She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. David answered instead. Maybe you should sit down. I turned toward him. No, I've been sitting down for years. That shut him up. Emily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Mom, please, just let me explain. You've had plenty of time to explain. I know. Then explain. She looked toward the doorway, as if she was afraid one of the children might walk in. Not here. I almost laughed. Emily, you invited me into this house 3 hours ago because you wanted me here for Thanksgiving. I walked through that door carrying presents for your kids. I smiled at you. I hugged you. I helped put food on the table. And all afternoon I've been wondering why you and David were talking about my will. Her face crumpled. You heard us. I heard enough. David stepped closer. Your mother misunderstood the conversation. I looked at him. Then you should have no trouble explaining it. He didn't answer. That was the first moment I knew my suspicion wasn't paranoia. Something was wrong. Emily reached into a drawer and pulled out a thin manila envelope. I found this 6 months ago. She placed it on the counter. I stared at it. Where? In Dad's old desk. My heart tightened. After my husband Robert died, I had cleaned that desk myself. At least I thought I had. I remembered every drawer, every envelope, every old receipt, every photograph. How could I have missed it? Because it wasn't in the desk anymore. I frowned. What does that mean? Emily swallowed. Dad had a second hiding place. David looked sharply at her. Emily. She ignored him. He told me about it years ago. I looked from her to him. Why would your father tell you about something he never told me? He didn't tell me everything. What did he tell you? Emily looked down. He said that if anything ever happened to him, there was one document I needed to find before anyone else did. My fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. What document? The original will. I looked at the papers in front of me. I already had his will. No, Emily whispered. You had the will that was filed after he died. I felt the room go strangely quiet. What are you saying? Emily opened the envelope. Inside was a photocopy of a handwritten document, several pages long, with Robert's signature at the bottom. My husband's handwriting. I knew it immediately. I had watched those hands sign birthday cards, mortgage papers, Christmas checks, and notes he left beside my coffee cup. I recognized every curve. Where's the original? Emily hesitated. That's the problem. My stomach dropped. Who has it? She looked at David, then back at me. We don't know. I stared at her. You said you found it. I found a copy. Where did the copy come from? Dad made it. Why? Emily's voice became smaller. Because he was afraid someone would destroy the original. I sat down. Not because I was weak, because suddenly my legs didn't feel like they belonged to me. My husband had died 7 years earlier. For 7 years I had believed I understood what happened after his death. We had divided the estate according to the will I knew about. The house went to me. Certain investments were placed into accounts for Emily and the grandchildren. Robert had left some money to charities, and several personal items to family members. It had seemed ordinary. Sad, but ordinary. Now I was realizing that the man I had shared 34 years with had apparently been preparing for something I knew nothing about. "Why didn't you tell me?" Emily started crying. "Because I was scared." "Of me?" "No." "Then who?" She didn't answer. I looked at David. His face had gone pale, and suddenly I remembered the words I'd heard through the door earlier. "Mom can never find out about the will. She won't be around much longer anyway." My voice became very quiet. "David, what did you mean when you said I wouldn't be around much longer?" He looked at Emily. She whispered, "Tell her." David rubbed his forehead. "I didn't mean what it sounded like." "Then what did you mean?" "I meant your health." "My health?" "You've had problems. I have high blood pressure. I'm 68 years old. I'm not dying." "I know." "Then why would you say that?" He looked down. "I was talking about the life insurance." The words landed differently than I expected. "What life insurance?" Emily covered her face. I stared at her. "You knew?" She nodded. "Dad took out a policy before he died." "I knew about that policy?" "No, Mom." She lowered her hands. "You knew about the small one." I felt cold. "What small one?" "The policy you received after Dad died." I nodded slowly. "Yes. There was another one." "How much?" Emily didn't answer. David did. $2 million. For a moment, I couldn't speak. $2 million. I had spent years believing Robert had left us everything he reasonably could. Apparently, I hadn't even known the half of it. But money wasn't what frightened me. It was the reason he had hidden it. Why didn't I receive it? Emily looked at David. He finally said, "Because it was placed into a trust." "What trust?" "Your grandchildren's trust." I stared at him. "Why?" "That was Robert's decision." "No, that doesn't make sense. If he wanted his grandchildren protected, why didn't he tell me?" "Because he didn't trust the people around you." The room went silent. I looked at Emily. Who didn't he trust? She started crying again. "Mom." "Who?" "Dad was worried about David." David's head snapped toward her. "That isn't fair." He was. "I barely knew him when he made that decision." "You knew enough." I stood. "What did Robert know about you?" David stepped backward. "Nothing." I looked at Emily. "That's not true." She shook her head. "No." "Emily." She took a shaky breath. "Dad discovered that David had debts." David's face hardened. "That was years ago." "How much?" "It wasn't your business." I almost smiled. "Apparently it became my business the moment you started discussing my death." He looked away. Emily continued. "Dad found out David had taken money from a business account." David turned toward her. "I paid it back." "You did?" "Then what are we doing here?" "You paid it back after Dad confronted you." I stared at him. "Why would Robert keep this from me?" Emily answered. "Because he thought you would try to protect me." That hurt more than anything else. Because she was right. If Robert had told me that David had financial problems before Emily married him, I would have confronted him. I would have begged Emily to reconsider, and if she had refused, I would have stayed beside her anyway. That was who I was. A mother. Robert knew it. And apparently he had built an entire safety net around me, because he knew I would spend mine protecting everyone else. I looked at the handwritten will again. "What does this say?" Emily pulled another chair closer. "Dad changed the entire estate plan." "How?" "He left the house to you for life." "I already owned the house." "No." I looked up. "What?" "The house was transferred into a family trust before he died." I stared at her. "Why?" "Because Dad believed someone might try to force you to sell it." "Who?" Emily's eyes moved toward David. My stomach sank. He thought David would eventually try to get control of it. David shook his head. "That was never my intention." "Then why did you ask Mom to refinance the house last year?" I turned toward him. "You told me it was a good way to lower the monthly expenses." "It was." "You wanted me to sign something. It was a refinancing package." "Was it?" He didn't answer. Emily reached for the photocopy. "Dad wrote instructions." "What instructions?" She handed me the final page. My hands shook as I read. Robert had written that the house was never to be sold without my written consent while I was alive. Not Emily's, not David's, mine. And beneath that was something I hadn't expected. If I ever became unable to make decisions for myself, control would pass to Emily, not David. I looked at my daughter. You knew about this? Not until 6 months ago. Then why were you talking about my will? Emily closed her eyes. Because David wanted me to change it. My chest tightened. Why? He said the trust was outdated. He said the grandchildren needed a different arrangement. He said you were going to leave everything to charity. I looked at David. Did I? No. Then why did you tell her that? I was trying to protect our family. From what? From you. The words came out before he could stop them. Emily looked horrified. I stared at him. From me? He immediately shook his head. That's not what I meant. Yes, it is. He rubbed his face. You don't understand how complicated things have become. Then make me understand. He didn't. Instead, Emily stepped between us. Mom, David has been under a lot of pressure. I looked at her. And you protected him. She began to cry. I thought I was protecting you. That sentence stopped me. What? Emily looked directly at me. I knew Dad had left instructions. I knew there was something wrong with the original will, and I knew David was looking for it. I felt the anger drain from my body and something colder replace it. Why didn't you tell me? Because he told me if I did, he'd lose everything. Who told you? David. I looked at my son-in-law. He sat down. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely frightened. I never meant for this to happen. What did you mean to happen? He was silent. I waited. Finally, he said, I wanted Emily to have control of the trust. Why? Because we were in debt. There it was. Not greed, not some grand conspiracy. Debt. A business that had failed. Loans, credit cards, tax problems. A house that was worth far more than the remaining mortgage. David had convinced Emily that if she could gain control of my estate, they could solve everything. And Emily, terrified of losing her home, and terrified of telling me the truth, had gone along with him. But there was still one thing I couldn't understand. Why did you say I wouldn't be around much longer? David looked at me. I was talking about the trust's age clause. What age clause? Emily went pale. I turned toward her. What age clause? She whispered. Dad wrote that the grandchildren wouldn't receive the principal until you died. I understood. David wasn't talking about killing me. He was talking about waiting for the trust to become accessible. But that didn't make the sentence less cruel. He had been speaking about my death as if it were a financial deadline. I looked at him. That's what I was to you. No. Then what was I? He had no answer. The children came into the kitchen at that exact moment. My grandson Noah was holding a plastic dinosaur. Grandma? I turned around quickly. Hey, sweetheart. He smiled. Are we still doing pie? I almost cried. Yes. Good. He ran back toward the dining room. Emily watched him go, then she looked at me. Mom, please. I shook my head. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all of this. You don't have to decide tonight. Yes, I do. She looked confused. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I've spent 7 years thinking my husband left me with a simple will. I looked at the old document. He didn't. Then I looked at Emily. And I've spent the last several hours believing my daughter wanted my money. Her eyes filled again. I don't. Then you need to tell me the truth. I do. All of it. She nodded. Emily told me what happened after Robert died. She said David discovered the trust existed while helping with some paperwork. At first he only wanted to understand it. Then his business began failing. He borrowed against their house, then against equipment, then from credit cards. Eventually, he convinced Emily that the trust was the only way they could avoid losing everything. Emily had started asking questions about my will. She had even asked me casually whether I intended to leave the house to her. I remembered that conversation. At the time, I'd thought she was simply planning for the future. Now I realized she had been testing me. Why bring me here today? Emily looked at the Thanksgiving table. Because I wanted to tell you. Then why didn't you? I tried. When? This morning. I remembered her strange expression when I arrived. She had hugged me too tightly. She had looked like she wanted to say something. Then David had walked into the kitchen, and she had stopped. I was afraid he'd leave, she whispered. Leave you? Leave the kids. I understood then. Emily hadn't been protecting money. She had been protecting her children from the consequences of their father's financial decisions, but she'd made one terrible mistake. She had protected them by lying to me, and lies, even frightened ones, still hurt. I turned toward David. You need to understand something. He looked up. The house is not the problem. He swallowed. The trust isn't the problem either. I put the original document on the table. You treated my death like a financial event. His eyes filled with shame. I know. You made my daughter afraid to tell me the truth. I know. You put my grandchildren in the middle of something they never asked for. I know. And you made me walk into this Thanksgiving believing my family wanted me gone. He couldn't answer. Emily reached for my hand. I let her hold it. That surprised both of us. I am angry with you, I told her. I know. I don't forgive you yet. She nodded. But I don't want to lose you. She began crying. I don't want to lose you either. I squeezed her hand. Then we start with the truth. The next morning I met with the attorney Robert had originally used when he created the trust. His name was Martin Hayes. He was older now, but he remembered my husband immediately. When I showed him the copy of the original will, he went very quiet. This is Robert's signature, he said. I know. He looked at me. Margaret, there's something you need to understand. What? This document was never revoked. I stared at him. Then why was it not the will used after Robert died? Because the later document was presented as the valid amendment. Was it? Martin hesitated. No. My heart stopped. What do you mean? He opened a file. Your husband signed the amendment, but it was never properly witnessed. I stared at him. So legally, it was never valid. I closed my eyes. 7 years. 7 years of believing one version of my husband's wishes. Martin continued. Robert anticipated this. What? He left a sealed letter with me. I opened my eyes. A letter? Yes. He handed it to me. My name was written across the front in Robert's handwriting. My hands began shaking. I opened it. There were only a few pages. Robert explained everything. He had discovered David's financial problems. He had also discovered that David had been pressuring Emily about the family property. Robert didn't trust confrontation. So he created the trust. He made sure I would always have control of the house while I was alive. And he made Emily the next protector of the trust. Specifically because he believed she would put her children ahead of money. Then he wrote the sentence that broke me. He said he had kept the truth from me, because he knew I would spend my final years worrying about everyone, except myself. That was Robert. Even in death he knew me too well. But there was one final instruction. If anyone ever tried to use his estate to pressure me, I was to take control personally and stop protecting the people who were hurting me. I read that line 3 times. Then I cried. Not because of the money, because my husband had known that one day I might need permission to choose myself. I returned home that afternoon. Emily was waiting outside. David was gone. She looked at my face. You know. I nodded. She started crying. Is he leaving? No. I shook my head. He's going to sell the business assets and repay what he can. The attorney is handling the rest. And us? I looked at her. You're my daughter. She stepped closer. But things aren't going back to normal. I know. We're going to rebuild trust slowly. She nodded. And the house? I looked at the place where I'd raised her. The house stays with me. She nodded again. And after I'm gone, it goes into the trust for your children. Her eyes filled with tears. Mom, not because you asked for it, I know. Because your father wanted it that way. She hugged me. This time, I hugged her back. It didn't erase what happened. It didn't magically repair 7 years of silence, but it was a beginning. David eventually moved out. He didn't go to prison. He didn't lose everything overnight. Real life doesn't usually work like that. He sold the business, paid his creditors, and went through a long financial restructuring. Emily stayed with the children. She got a job. She started rebuilding her independence. And slowly, over the next year, our relationship became something different. More honest. Less comfortable sometimes. But real. The grandchildren never knew the full details. They only knew that Grandma's house was still Grandma's house, and that Thanksgiving happened there the following year. I cooked the turkey. Emily brought the pie. And before dinner she stood beside me in the kitchen. Mom, yeah? Dad would have been proud of you. I smiled sadly. I think he'd have told me I was too stubborn. She laughed through her tears. He would have. I looked at the table, at the photographs, at the empty chair where Robert used to sit. For years I thought the worst thing my family could do was fight over money. I was wrong. The worst thing they could do was make me believe that my worth to them could be measured by what I might leave behind. Robert's original will didn't make me richer, it made me see the truth. The house wasn't really what he had been protecting. He had been protecting me from becoming a woman who spent the rest of her life apologizing for having something other people wanted. And Emily learned something too. Protecting someone and deceiving them are not the same thing. Sometimes you tell the truth even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. Because family isn't supposed to be the place where you hide the truth to keep the peace. It's supposed to be the place where you can finally tell the truth and still know that somehow you'll find your way back to each other.